My name is Rena Calloway, and I was 31 years old when my stepmother handed me a key to a property she described as worthless and told me to get out of her house by Friday. She said it the way you say something you have already decided. Flat. Final. The way a person speaks when the decision was made long before the conversation started, and the conversation is just the paperwork. She stood in the hallway of the house I had grown up in, the house my father had built on Birch Hollow Road with money he saved for 11 years driving long haul. And she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has finally arrived at it. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. You can take the mill property, Lorraine said. Your father left it in the will separately. Everything else passes to me. She held out the key the way you hold out something you don't want to touch longer than necessary. Small, old, iron, the kind with a simple barrel and a loop at the top. The kind of key that belongs to something that has not been opened in a long time. I took it. She let go immediately. The attorney had already read the will that morning. I had sat in a chair that was too hard on my left side while Pelham, the estate lawyer, explained in the measured tone of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer registers as news that my father's estate, the house, the savings account, the truck, the equipment in the barn, passed entirely to Lorraine Calloway as surviving spouse. The mill property on Garnett Creek Road, half an acre and whatever structure stood on it, passed to me, his daughter, by name. Pelham had called it the old Calloway mill property. He said it the way you'd say a storage locker or a utility shed. A thing to be mentioned and moved past. Lorraine had not looked at me during the reading. She looked at the table. I looked at my hands. My father had been dead for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks I had been sleeping in the small bedroom off the kitchen, the one he had always called the guest room even though no guests had ever used it. And I had been eating whatever Lorraine left on the stove and trying not to take up space in a house that had stopped feeling like mine the year my father married her. That was 9 years ago. I was 22 and she was 38, and my father looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot believe he was lucky enough to find. I had liked her at first. She laughed easily and she made good coffee, and she had a way of sitting at the kitchen table with her chin in her hand that reminded me, in a certain light, of my mother, who had been gone since I was 7. But the likeness was just a trick of light. My mother had been the kind of woman who listened when you talked. Lorraine was the kind of woman who waited while you talked. And the difference only becomes clear after years of being in the same room with both kinds. My father's name was Owen Calloway. He was 63 when he died of the thing that had been working on him quietly for 3 years, a slow machinery failure that the doctors named and renamed and ultimately could not stop. He had known it was coming, long before he told me. I found that out later. It was not the only thing I found out later. He died on a November morning when the frost was still on the grass, and I was the one who found him. Lorraine had been at her sister's in Clarksville. I had come to bring him groceries and check on the kitchen faucet he'd mentioned was dripping. He was in his chair by the window, the one that looked out over the back field, and the sun was on his face, and he looked more like himself than he had in months. I stayed with him until the ambulance came, and then I stayed after, because there was no other way to be. Lorraine arrived that afternoon and stood in the doorway of the living room and said, "So that was it." And then she called her sister back. The 6 weeks between that morning and the morning in Pelham's office had been the strangest of my life. Not the grief, exactly. Grief I could locate. It sat in my chest behind my sternum like a stone I had learned to carry. What I could not locate was the feeling underneath it, the feeling of watching a house rearrange itself around you. Furniture moved to different walls, objects appearing and disappearing, a reordering so gradual and so deliberate that you couldn't name a single moment when it had happened. And yet by the end of it you were standing in a hallway that felt like someone else's. My father's workbench had been cleared before the funeral. His tools were gone before the service. I found this out when I went to the garage looking for his level, which I wanted to keep because he had bought it at a hardware store the week before I was born and had written the date on the handle in black marker. The level was not there. The garage held Lorraine's garden equipment and a bag of water softener salt. I did not say anything. I was still in the stage of grief where the kindest thing you can do is say nothing, because the things you might say are the kind that cannot be taken back, and my father had raised me to be careful with words you cannot take back. Friday came. I put my things in the car. 3 boxes, a duffel bag, and the photograph from my bedroom wall. The one of my father and me at the county fair the summer I was 10. He is wearing a hat that is too big for him, and we are both eating fried dough, and I am laughing at something he said, and he is looking at the camera with the expression of a man who knows exactly what he has. I did not say goodbye to Lorraine. She was in the back of the house. I left my key on the kitchen counter, the house key, the one I had carried since I was old enough to come home from school alone, and I picked up the iron key from the mill property, and I drove. I had no clear picture of what I was driving toward. The mill property on Garnett Creek Road was a name on a deed and a key on a ring and whatever my father had left me, which Pelham had described as the structure and the half-acre parcel. I had heard the property mentioned once or twice over the years, in the way you hear about places that have been in a family long enough to become background noise. The Calloway Mill, my grandfather's operation, closed since before I was born. I had never been there. My father had not taken me there when I was a child, which I had thought, at the time, was simply because there was nothing there worth seeing. A closed mill on a creek was not a destination. It was just a thing that belonged to the family the way old furniture belongs to a family, present in the inventory without being present in the living. I drove south from Birch Hollow Road on the county road that runs along the ridge, then down through the flat bottom land where the creek spreads out in spring and the fields hold water until May. Garnett Creek Road is a gravel track that branches off the county road near a leaning mailbox that has not had a number on it in years. I almost missed the turn. The gravel was overgrown at the edges, grass pushing in from both sides, and the track curved almost immediately into a stand of old sycamores that blocked the light. I drove slowly. The car rocked over the ruts. The sycamores gave way after 50 yards to a flat clearing, and there it was. A stone building. Low, long, set close to the creek bank, with a water wheel on the north side that had not turned in decades. The stone was gray and green with moss along the lower courses, and the roof had been repaired at some point, a newer tin section over the old slate. Functional, if not beautiful. The windows were shuttered. The door, heavy wood and iron, sat flush in the wall with the particular solidity of something built to last and left to wait. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The creek moved behind the building. You could hear it, steady and indifferent, the sound of water that does not know or care about the structures people build along its banks. A crow crossed the clearing high and fast and disappeared into the sycamores. I got out. The air was cold and clean, the way air is in November in the bottomland when the leaves are down and nothing is blocking the sky. I walked to the door and tried the key. It turned. The inside was dark. I stood in the doorway while my eyes adjusted and the smell came to me first, stone and old wood, and something underneath, oil or metal, the ghost of machinery that had been still for a long time. Then the shapes came clear. The main room was larger than the exterior suggested, the ceiling high enough that the old mill machinery, the drying frames, and the fulling stocks were still in place, still standing, covered with canvas tarps the way you'd cover something you intended to return to. Along the north wall, wooden shelving ran floor to ceiling, and on the shelves, in careful rows, were things my father had put there. I knew it was him immediately. Not because I recognized the objects, I didn't, not yet, but because of the order. My father was a man of particular habits, and one of those habits was a deliberate, patient order that expressed itself in everything he touched. His tools had always been arranged by use and size. His files had always been labeled in the same precise hand. Whatever was on those shelves had been arranged by someone who thought carefully before placing anything and expected someone else to understand the arrangement. I walked to the shelves. On the first shelf, a row of labeled jars. Components, by the look of them, small metal parts, springs and pins and fittings, each jar labeled in my father's handwriting with a name and a number. On the second shelf, 3 cloth-wrapped bundles, the wrapping tight and carefully knotted. On the third, a row of notebooks, 9 of them, same kind, same dark blue cover, arranged by date. The earliest labeled 2019, the most recent 2022. My father had died in 2022. On the workbench against the south wall, a steel box with a hasp latch. No lock on the hasp. Beside the box, an envelope, sealed, with my name on the front. I recognized the handwriting from across the room. I crossed the room and stood at the workbench and looked at the envelope for a long time without picking it up. The stone walls held the cold. The creek moved outside. Above me, The old timber frame of the mill roof was dark with age, solid as the day it was laid. I picked up the envelope. Inside, for pages, handwritten, the pen pressed harder than usual on some letters, compensating for the tremor that had started in his right hand the year before he died. My father's voice came off the page in the particular way that words can carry a person's voice when you have heard that voice your whole life. I read standing at the workbench, in the cold, in the quiet, and by the third paragraph I understood that what I had thought was a closed mill was not what my father had left me at all. He had written, "Rena, if you're reading this, you came to the mill. That's the first thing, and I'm glad. I want you to know I thought about this for a long time. I want you to know the mill is not what Lorraine told you it was. It's not what I let people believe, either. I need to explain why I kept it quiet, and I need to explain what's here, and I need to ask you to do something with it that I couldn't do myself." He wrote for 4 pages. He wrote about the mill's history, which went back to his grandfather, who had built it as a wool fulling operation in the years before synthetic fabric made that work obsolete. He wrote about what he had been doing there in the 3 years before he died. He wrote about the people he had spoken with and the records he had kept, and the reason he had kept all of it separate and quiet and away from the house on Birch Hollow Road. He wrote, "Lorraine is not a bad person. I want you to understand that. She is a person who measures the value of things by what they can be sold for, and that is a reasonable way to measure if you grew up without much, which she did. I don't blame her for it. But it means she looks at the mill and sees an old stone building on a creek and a rusted water wheel, and she is not wrong about what it looks like. She has never been here. She doesn't know what I've been doing here, and that is something I decided deliberately, because what I was doing here was for you, and I needed to be certain it would reach you intact." He wrote, "I'm going to tell you what's in the steel box and what's on the shelves and what I need you to do next. I'm going to try to write it clearly because my right hand has been unreliable lately, and I don't have the energy to rewrite if I'm not clear the first time." I sat down on the workbench stool and read the rest of the letter. When I finished, I sat for a long time in the cold and the quiet. The creek moved outside and the crow, or another one, crossed the clearing again. Then I opened the steel box. My name is not an unusual name in this part of the state. Calloways have been in the county since before the county had its current name, since before the roads were paved, since before the creek was given its English name over whatever name it held before that. My grandfather Owen Calloway built the fulling mill on Garnett Creek in 1931, during the years when wool was still being processed locally, and a mill operation could sustain a family if the family was willing to work it. He ran it until 1964, when the synthetic fabric market completed what it had been doing slowly for a decade, and the operation became uneconomic. He closed the mill, but he did not sell it. He kept the building, kept the half-acre, kept the machinery under canvas. He passed it to my father not with any instructions, but with the understanding that it was Calloway property, and Calloway property stayed in the family. That was the whole of the philosophy. My father had carried that property for 30 years without doing anything particular with it. He paid the taxes. He checked on the roof after storms. He replaced a section of the south wall where the mortar had given way, doing the work himself one summer when I was in middle school. He told me once that the mill was part of the land and the land was part of the family, and that was reason enough to keep it. I had understood that the way a child understands things, as a given, without examining it. What I had not known, what I could not have known, was that 3 years before he died my father had started coming to the mill not just to maintain it, but to work in it. Not the old fulling operation. Something else. He had begun, slowly and carefully, to restore the equipment. Not the mill machinery itself, not the stocks and frames and water wheel, though he had assessed those and understood their condition. What he had been restoring, in the back room behind the main floor, in the room that had served as the mill's storage and drying space, were the things that had accumulated on Calloway property over 3 generations. Equipment, textile equipment, hand looms, spinning machinery, a warping mill, dye vessels. Things his grandfather had collected from other operations that closed over the decades, hauled to Garnett Creek Road, and stored under canvas the same way the mill machinery had been stored, in the way of men who believe that useful things should not be discarded even when their moment has passed. My father had spent 3 years learning what he had. He had called dealers and historians and restoration specialists. He had driven to see comparable pieces at auction. He had kept meticulous records in the 9 blue notebooks on the shelf. He had wrapped the components carefully and labeled every jar and documented every piece of work he completed on every machine. By the time he died, he had restored 3 of the pieces to working condition. 2 more were partially done. The rest had been assessed and cataloged and, in several cases, had been the subject of inquiries from collectors and institutions who had heard, through the network my father had been quietly building, that a collection of early American textile equipment in unusually good condition existed in western Tennessee. I read all of this in the letter, and then I sat with it for a long time. He had written, "I know this seems like a lot. I know you're probably sitting there cold because the mill doesn't have heat, and I never got around to putting a wood stove in it the way I meant to. I know you're probably wondering why I kept all of this from you, and from Lorraine, and from everyone. Here's why. The mill property is yours. It was always going to be yours. I filed the deed transfer separately, through an attorney named Sylvia Crane in the county seat, and that transfer is complete and recorded. The will mentions it because it is proper to mention it, but the legal transfer happened before the will was read. Before I died. The mill has been in your name since last spring. I understand why he had done it that way. The understanding came slowly, like the creek sound, background at first, and then present in everything. He had known Lorraine would assess what he left. He had known she would measure it and find it wanting, as she measured everything she could not immediately price. He had wanted the mill's value to be clear before it passed to me, in a form that could not be questioned or challenged or reduced by someone else's appraisal of what old stone buildings on creeks were worth. He had built the documentation and the network and the legal structure carefully and quietly, and then he had died, trusting that I would come here and find it. The steel box held the deed. It held the letter from Sylvia Crane confirming the transfer and its recording date. It held a file folder with photographs of each piece of equipment, assessment notes in my father's handwriting, and a contact list. Dealers. Historians. A textile museum in Georgia that had expressed interest in 3 of the pieces. A woman named Adair Holt in North Carolina who had asked specifically about the warping mill and had been told it was not yet available. And at the bottom of the box, under the file folder, a folded single sheet of paper in a different hand. Not my father's. The letterhead said Sotheby's, and the letter was addressed to Owen Calloway, and it was dated 14 months before he died. I read it standing at the workbench with my coat still on. The letter was an inquiry. A specialist in American decorative arts and historical textiles had heard through a colleague about the Calloway collection and was asking whether any of the pieces might be available for consideration in an upcoming auction dedicated to early American industrial equipment and folk technology. My father had never responded to the letter. I found out why when I read the second-to-last page of his letter to me. He had written, "I got a letter from an auction house a while back. I kept it for you. I didn't respond because I needed to finish what I was doing with the pieces first, and because I wanted you to have the whole picture before any conversation about what to sell, and when, and to whom. Some things should be kept. Some things should go where they'll be studied and used by people who understand them. That's your decision to make, not mine. I didn't want to make it for you. I just wanted to make sure you had the information you needed and the time you needed and the legal standing you needed to make it yourself." I folded the letter and put it back in the steel box with the deed and the contact list and the Sotheby's inquiry, and I closed the lid. I did not close the hasp. I left it open, the way you leave a door open when you intend to come back through it. I walked through the main room to the back door and opened it and stood on the creek bank. The water was low for November, running clear over flat stones, the color of old glass. On the far bank, a stand of river birch still held their leaves, yellow-brown, the last ones of the season, curling at the edges and ready to fall. I had $37 in my checking account and no place to sleep that night. Those 2 facts sat beside the deed and the contact list and the Sotheby's letter with a quality of contrast that was almost funny, in the way that certain contrasts are funny only if you are the person they are happening to, and then only later. My father had left me a network and a legal foundation and 3 years of careful, quiet work. I had $37 and a car with a quarter tank of gas. The practical problem had to be addressed before anything else could be. I had a friend named Cassie Drover who lived 20 minutes from Garnett Creek Road, in a farmhouse she rented with 2 other women who worked at the hospital in the county seat. Cassie and I had been close in high school and had drifted in the way people drift when life takes them different directions and then come back, the way people come back when one of them has a father who dies and needs a place to put her boxes. I had called Cassie the day after the will reading, and she had said come, and had not asked how long, and had not mentioned the room she was giving up. I drove to Cassie's house and carried in my 3 boxes and my duffel and the photograph from the county fair, and I sat at her kitchen table and ate a bowl of soup she put in front of me without asking, and I told her about the mill. She listened the way she had always listened, with the particular quality of attention that means the person is actually tracking what you are saying and not preparing their response. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your father built you a way out, and Lorraine handed you the key without knowing what she was handing you, Cassie said. That's exactly right, I said. So what do you do first? I had been thinking about this on the drive. I had a list in my head, the way my father had always made lists, ordered by dependency, the things that had to happen before the other things could happen. First, I needed to understand what was in those notebooks. The full picture. The 9 blue notebooks were 3 years of assessment and restoration work and documentation, and I could not make any decisions until I understood what was in them completely. Second, I needed to call Sylvia Crane. She had prepared the deed transfer, and she would know the legal standing of everything, and she would be able to tell me if there was anything else I needed to do to protect what my father had set up. Third, I needed to go back to the mill with better lighting and a longer coat and spend a day with the pieces themselves, not just the photographs and the notes. Everything else came after that. Cassie nodded. She refilled my soup without asking. Outside, the November dark came down early the way it does in the bottom land, the sky going from gray to purple to black in the space of 20 minutes. I need to look at the notebooks tonight, I said. She slid the pot back on the stove. I'll make more soup. I went out to the car and brought in the 9 blue notebooks, still smelling of stone and cold, and I set them on Cassie's kitchen table and began with 2019. My father's handwriting in the early notebooks was clean and confident, the right hand still steady. He had started with an inventory, systematic, room by room, each piece photographed and numbered and described in the careful language of a man who has taught himself to look at objects the way specialists look at them, with attention to the markers of age and origin and condition. He had learned this language somewhere. I found out from the 3rd notebook, through a correspondence with a man named Garrett Meacham in Ohio, who ran a small consultancy in historical agricultural and industrial equipment. Meacham had apparently been willing to educate my father by mail over the course of a year in exchange for access to the collection for his own research purposes. This arrangement was documented in the 3rd notebook in a section my father had titled Notes on the Meacham Correspondence, and it was systematic enough that it read like a course of study, questions asked and answered and applied, the knowledge building from one notebook to the next. By the 4th notebook, my father's assessments had become precise. He could date a piece by its construction techniques, by the wear patterns, by the hardware. He knew what was original and what had been repaired and when the repairs had likely been made. He knew which pieces were rare and why. He had started writing comparative notes, the kind that referenced auction results and museum holdings and private collections. The 5th notebook, 2020, was the year the tremor started. You could see it in the handwriting, a slight irregularity at first, then more pronounced, the letters more carefully formed as the hand became less cooperative. But the notes themselves became more detailed, not less, as though whatever the illness was taking from his body, it was not taking from his attention. He had written in the 5th notebook, in a section about a large foot-powered spinning wheel that he had dated to approximately 1820. I understand now why my grandfather kept these things. He kept them because he understood that the objects a culture makes to sustain itself carry information that the written record doesn't hold. The weight of the flyer, the wear on the drive band hook. These are things that tell you how many hours someone sat at this wheel, how many winters, how much of a family's warmth passed through these hands. I don't know if that has a dollar value. I think it probably does, to the right person. But I also think that's not the only kind of value it has. I stopped reading and sat with that for a moment. Cassie was at the table across from me, reading something of her own, giving me the courtesy of presence without intrusion. The kitchen was warm. The soup was good. Outside, the creek was invisible in the dark, but somewhere to the south Garnett Creek was doing what it had always done, running over the stones toward the river that ran toward the sea. I went back to the notebooks. By 2021, the year of the 7th notebook, my father had completed the restoration of the first piece, the warping mill that Adair Holt in North Carolina had inquired about. The seventh notebook documented the work in detail, each stage, the problem with the tensioning rods that had required him to source a replacement from a supplier in Vermont, the way he had refinished the frame using period-appropriate techniques he had learned from a woodworker named Cal Presser who lived 20 miles away and had come out twice to advise. He had also, in the seventh notebook, begun documenting inquiries. Adair Holt, a museum in Georgia. Meacham himself, who had asked about the 1820 spinning wheel for a client. Each inquiry carefully noted with the date and the nature of the interest, and the figure mentioned if a figure had been mentioned. Some of the figures were significant. I had understood, from the letter, that the collection was not nothing. But reading the notebooks gave me the specifics, and the specifics were of a different order than I had been prepared for. Not enough to change the shape of a life entirely, but enough to change the pressure of it. Enough to make decisions from ground that was stable rather than from the feeling of standing on someone else's floor. My father had known these numbers. He had written them down in the notebooks and put the notebooks on the shelf and left the steel box open and expected me to come and find them. I turned to the eighth notebook, 2022, the last full year. The handwriting was difficult by then. The tremor had progressed, and the letters were formed with effort, some of them written more than once, crossed out and reformed until they were legible. But the precision was there, the same attention, the same methodical approach. He had finished the second restoration in February, a small loom with an unusual heddle construction that Meacham had identified as possibly New England in origin and earlier than most comparable surviving examples. He had started the third restoration in April, a large frame loom that he believed had been built by his grandfather's grandfather in the decade before the Civil War. He had documented the work through June, when the entries became shorter, when the illness clearly required more of him than the restoration could spare. The last entry in the eighth notebook was dated July 14, 2022, for months before he died. He had written, "Can't do much today. Sat with the loom for an hour and looked at it. The joinery is good. Whoever built this knew what they were doing and built it to last. I'd like to finish it. Maybe I will. If not, Rena will. She's always been better with her hands than she gives herself credit for. She doesn't know it yet, but she has the right temperament for this kind of work. Patient, detail-oriented, doesn't rush the thing that needs time. I think she'll understand what I was doing here." I closed the eighth notebook. The ninth was thin, only 14 pages, the entries few and brief, the last one in September. I didn't read it that night. I set it aside for later, for a moment when I was ready for the last things he had written. It was past midnight. Cassie had gone to bed an hour ago, leaving the light on over the stove for me. The soup pot was still on the back burner, warm if I wanted more. I sat at the table with the 8 blue notebooks stacked in order in front of me and the steel box beside them and the iron key on its ring on the edge of the table, and I thought about what came next. Lorraine had handed me the key because she thought the mill was nothing. She had said it was nothing, not in those exact words, but in the architecture of her dismissal, in the way she held the key at arm's length, in the way Pelham had moved past the property in the reading as though it were an item in a storage unit inventory. Nothing. Worthless. Old stone building on a creek. My father had spent 3 years making certain she was wrong about that, and he had done it quietly, without telling her, without telling anyone except Meacham and Sylvia Crane and the handful of people in the contact list who already understood what they were dealing with. He had left me a way through. Not a windfall. Not a rescue. A way through, built with patience and attention and the particular kind of love that expresses itself through preparation rather than declaration. He had not been able to stay, but he had done what he could in the time he had, and what he had done was this. I put the notebooks back in my bag, careful with their order. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark. Through the window, the fields were white with frost. The sky was clear and the stars were out, the kind of November sky that looks like it was designed to be looked at, high and cold and full of light that traveled a long way to get here. My father had always said that the worth of a thing is not what it looks like from the road. I was starting to understand what he meant. In the morning, I called Sylvia Crane. Her office was in the county seat, a 2-story building on the south end of Main Street that shared a facade with a title company and a notary. I had looked her up the night before on Cassie's phone and found a brief listing, Crane Legal Services, Estate and Property Law, established 2003. No photograph, a phone number, and an address. She answered on the second ring. I told her my name. I told her my father's name. Before I could say anything else, she said, "I've been expecting your call."
Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story.
A beat. Your father told me you would call when you were ready, she said. He said it might take some time, but that you'd come. I was standing in Cassie's kitchen in yesterday's clothes with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, and the sensation of the floor shifting slightly under me. The way a floor shifts when you step on a board that has more give than you expected. He came to me 2 years ago, Sylvia said. Not through the estate attorney. Separately. He said he wanted the mill property transfer to be clean and complete and recorded before anything else happened. And he said he wanted to understand what he had there and whether the documentation would hold. I asked what she meant by whether it would hold. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is choosing the precise word. He was concerned, she said, that without proper documentation, the collection could be disputed. Not the property itself, the transfer was clean, but the contents. What was in the mill was on mill property, and mill property was yours by deed. But he wanted it documented as his property, his to pass, with provenance established on the key pieces so there would be no question later about where they came from or who had the right to them. So he documented everything. He documented everything, she confirmed. With Meacham's help and with some assistance from an archivist at the State University who had an interest in the collection's historical significance. There are provenance files on each piece. They're in the safe at my office. There is a safe at my office, she said, and it has a folder in it that belongs to you. I asked when I could come in. She said this afternoon if you can manage it. I drove to the county seat with a full tank of gas, which Cassie had paid for that morning without asking and without making it something that needed to be discussed. That was who Cassie was. She understood the difference between help that costs the person receiving it and help that doesn't, and she had always been careful to give the second kind. Sylvia Crane's office was small and organized in the way of someone who has been at the same work in the same space long enough that every object has found its correct position. She was in her early 60s, gray-haired, with the direct manner of a person who has spent years translating complicated things into language that holds up under examination. She shook my hand once, firmly, and sat me down across from her desk. She put a folder in front of me. Your father was thorough, she said. That is the best word for it. Thorough. I opened the folder. The provenance documentation was organized by piece, each piece numbered to match the photographs in the steel box. For each one, a record of acquisition, how it had come to the mill, who had owned it before, what the chain of possession was. For the pieces that had been restored, a restoration record including the work performed, the materials used, and the consultants involved. For the pieces that had been the subject of inquiries, a log of those inquiries with dates and figures. And at the front of the folder, a cover letter from Sylvia herself, addressed to me, summarizing the legal standing of the collection and the property. The deed transfer, recorded 11 months before my father's death, fully executed, no conditions or encumbrances. The collection, documented as the property of Owen Calloway, now passed to me as the owner of the mill property. The provenance records, filed with her office and with a copy at the State University archives. She said, if anyone challenges your right to the collection or to the property, this is your answer. A deed recorded 11 months before his death is not an estate maneuver. It is a straightforward property transfer from a living owner to his adult daughter. The collection provenance is documented to a standard that would satisfy any auction house or museum. There is nothing here that invites questions. I said, Lorraine doesn't know about any of this. She said, your father was careful about what he shared and with whom. What he did at this office was his business, and it remained his business. We had no contact with the estate. Attorney's office. I looked at the folder in my hands and thought about Lorraine in the hallway on Birch Hollow Road, holding the key at arm's length, certain she was giving me nothing. She had given me everything my father intended me to have. I asked Sylvia what I should do first. She was practical and clear, the way my father had been, and I understood immediately why he had chosen her. She told me to get a certified copy of the deed from the county recorder's office, which would be my primary document in any conversation about ownership. She told me to contact Meacham in Ohio to let him know I had taken possession and to review the current status of the inquiries he had been managing. She told me to read the 9th notebook, which she knew about because my father had told her it was there, before I made any decisions about what to sell and when. She said, he said the 9th notebook is the most important one. He said it explains his thinking about what should stay and what should go. He said you would understand it better than the others once you had read all the others first. I said I had not read it yet. She nodded. That's appropriate. He said you'd know when you were ready. Before I left, she gave me her card and told me that if Lorraine or anyone else raised questions about the mill property, I should direct them to her office. I said I thought Lorraine believed the mill was worthless. Sylvia looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has seen this particular kind of situation before. That may be true now, she said. It may not always be true. People recalibrate when they understand they were wrong about something's value. And when they recalibrate, they sometimes look for a way to change what has already been decided. I want you to be prepared for that. I said I understood. On the drive back to Cassie's house, I thought about the word recalibrate. It was the right word. Lorraine was a person who assessed and reassessed constantly, who moved through the world with a continuous running calculation of what things were worth and what they were not. The mill had been assigned to the not worth category years ago, probably the first time my father had mentioned it, and the category had held because nothing had happened to question it. But I had a deed and a folder and 9 notebooks and a contact list and a letter from Sotheby's, and all of it was documented and all of it was mine. And when Lorraine eventually learned what was in that mill, the category was going to change. I needed to be ready before that happened. That evening, I sat at Cassie's kitchen table and opened the 9th notebook. My father's handwriting in the 9th notebook was the worst it had ever been. Each letter formed separately, with effort, the way a person writes when the hand will not cooperate with the mind, but the mind is still fully present. The entries were short, sometimes only a few sentences, sometimes less. But the precision was there. The attention was there. He had written, in the first entry of the 9th notebook, dated 2 weeks before the last entry in the 8th. I want to write down what I think should happen to the collection. Not as a directive, as a record of my thinking. So Rena has something to start from when she has to make these decisions. He had written about each piece, one by one, in the order he had numbered them. For some, he had written keep. For some, he had written sell, with notes on who he thought should have the piece and why, which institution or which collector would give it the best use. For a few he had written I don't know yet, which meant he had not resolved his thinking before the illness prevented him from continuing. The warping mill that Adair Holt had asked about was marked keep, with a note. This one is not old enough to be historically significant in the way the others are, but it is in the best condition of all of them, and it is the one that most clearly shows how my grandfather worked. The quality of the joinery is his. I know his joinery. I would like Rena to keep this one at least for now. The spinning wheel dated to 1820 was marked sell, with a note. This should go to a museum or an institution that will study it properly. I have been in correspondence with 2 museums, one in Georgia and one in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Museum has expressed more specific interest. The contact is in the folder. Tell them Meacham recommended them and they will understand the provenance. The large frame loom, the one he had not been able to finish, was marked a question mark, followed by a sentence. I could not finish this one. I would like it to be finished. If it can be finished, it should be. I think this is the most important piece in the collection, and I would like someone who understands it to decide its fate, not someone who only knows what it looks like. I read that twice. The most important piece in the collection. He had not written why. The notebook entry ended there. the writing trailing off at the end of the line in a way that suggested the hand had stopped cooperating and he had not returned to the sentence. I turned to the last entry. It was dated 2 weeks before he died. He had written, in the most effortful handwriting in any of the 9 notebooks, each letter made with deliberate care, "I think Rena will understand all of this. She was always better at seeing what is there than at saying what she sees. I don't know if that's something I gave her or something she came to herself. Probably both. I want her to know that the mill was not just a plan. It was also a place I was glad to have. The work here was mine, and it was good, and it mattered to me in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who wasn't here for it. I want her to know that." I closed the 9th notebook and set it on top of the others. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the frost was on the grass again, the second night of it, the early winter settling in. I sat there for a long time with my father's notebooks stacked in front of me and the iron key on the table and the sense, which I had been having since I first turned that key in the lock of the mill door, that what I was holding was not a thing that could be quickly or neatly resolved. It was going to take time. There were decisions to make and phone calls to make and a large frame loom that needed to be finished and an auction house that had sent a letter 14 months ago that had not yet been answered. I was not in a hurry. My father had not been in a hurry. He had spent 3 years doing this work carefully, and he had left me the structure to continue it carefully, and I was going to do that. But first I was going to go back to the mill in the morning with better lighting and a longer coat, and I was going to stand in front of that large frame loom and look at it the way my father had looked at things, with attention to what was there. He had said the most important piece. I wanted to understand why. I drove to the mill the next morning with a work lamp from Cassie's garage, an extension cord, a thermos of coffee, and the notebook with Meacham's contact information folded inside the front cover. The frost was still on the grass when I turned onto Garnett Creek Road. The sycamores held the cold under their canopy, and the gravel crunched in a way that sounded different from the day before, more familiar. The sound of a road that was beginning to be mine rather than one I was arriving at for the first time. I parked in the clearing, left the car running for a moment with the heat on, and looked at the mill. In the morning light, it was a different building than it had been in the gray of the previous afternoon. The stone caught the early sun and went from cold gray to something warmer, the moss along the lower courses a deep green against the pale gold of the light. The water wheel on the north side, motionless for decades, still held its shape, the wood dark and weathered but intact, the kind of structure that had been built to move water and had been resting instead for 50 years and had not yet decided to give up. I went inside. The work lamp changed everything. I ran the extension cord from the car through the front door and hung the lamp from a hook my father had set in the main beam, and the mill interior went from shadow to legible. The machinery under its canvas tarps, the shelves of labeled jars, the 9 notebooks, which I had brought back with me and set on the workbench in their order, the steel box, its hasp still open. I walked through the main room to the back. The door to the back room was lower than the front, the lintel worn smooth, the wood of the frame dark with age. The latch was a simple iron bar, the same type as the front door, but smaller. I lifted it and pushed the door open. The back room smelled different from the main room. Older. The particular smell of wood that has been in one place for a long time, undisturbed, accumulating the slow patience of objects that have outlasted everything around them. The ceiling was lower here, the beams closer, and along the north wall, the creek wall, moisture had gotten into the stone at some point and been stopped, the repair visible as a lighter band of mortar between the older courses. Along the east and south walls, the pieces stood under their tarps. I counted 7. The warping mill my father had marked keep, the 1820 spinning wheel, the small loom with the unusual heddle, 2 others I had not yet read the full notes on, and at the far end of the south wall, under the largest tarp, the thing that stood floor to ceiling and extended 6 feet along the wall, the large frame loom. I crossed the room and lifted the edge of the tarp. The frame was oak, hand-pegged, the joinery fitted without nails or screws in the way of things built before those methods were standard. For posts, each the diameter of my forearm, rose from a base structure to a crown beam at the top. Between them, the beams and battens and heddle frames of a floor loom large enough to weave cloth in widths that no modern domestic loom would attempt. The treadles at the base were worn smooth in a way that told you how many hours someone had sat at this, how many feet had worked these pedals, how many mornings and evenings had passed with the sound of the shuttle moving through the shed. My father had gotten as far as cleaning the frame and documenting the existing damage. There were notes taped to the base, in his handwriting, listing what remained to be done. The treadle lashing needed to be replaced. 2 of the heddle frames needed restringing. The breast beam had a crack that needed to be stabilized before any tension was put on the loom. The warp beam pawl was missing and would need to be sourced or fabricated. The notes were dated June of the year he died. He had not touched it after June. I stood with my hand on the breast beam, on the crack he had identified and not yet repaired, and felt the wood under my palm. The grain was fine and close. Old-growth timber, the kind that doesn't come from second-growth forest, the kind cut from trees that had been standing for 100 years before they were felled. Someone had chosen this wood deliberately, had let it season properly, had worked it with tools that required skill and patience. Whoever built this knew what they were doing and built it to last. That was what he had written. I looked at the joinery at the top corner of the main frame, where the crown beam met the upright post. The mortise and tenon were cut with a precision that was not approximate. The fit was so close that no light came through the joint. 50 years after it was made, a century and a half after the loom was built, the joint was still tight. This is the most important piece in the collection. I went back to the workbench and found the 8th notebook, the one with the detailed notes on the loom's assessment. My father had dated the first assessment entry to September of 2021, when he had uncovered the loom for the first time after acquiring it from the collection of a closed mill in eastern Tennessee. He had written, "The loom came from the Warfield Mill in Hawkins County, which closed in 1887. The Warfield family kept their equipment rather than sell it at closure, and the building was used for storage until 2018, when the property was sold for development and the contents were auctioned. Meacham called me about it. He said there was a floor loom in the lot that I should look at. I drove up there on a Wednesday, and I understood immediately why he called. He had written, "The loom is pre-Civil War, possibly as early as 1840 based on the construction methods and the hardware. The frame is American white oak, hand-pegged, with no metal fasteners in the primary structure. The width is unusual for a domestic loom and more consistent with a commercial operation, but the construction details suggest it was not factory-built. Someone built this for a specific person or a specific purpose. The quality of the work is beyond what you'd see in a production piece. The heddle frames in particular show a level of craftsmanship that Meacham says he has not seen in comparable surviving examples." And then, near the end of the assessment entry, a sentence that stopped me. "There is a maker's mark on the inside face of the right upright post, near the base. Carved, not stamped. The initials C, H, C, and a date, 1847. I don't know yet what this means. I'm going to find out." I put the notebook down and went back to the loom. The right upright post, near the base, on the inside face. I crouched down and looked. The carving was shallow, the kind made with a small tool, deliberate and careful. The letters were neat, not ornamental, the work of someone who was marking rather than decorating. C, H, C, and below it, the year, 1847. I ran my finger over the letters. My grandfather's name was Owen Calloway. His father, my father had told me once, had been named something old-fashioned and biblical, a name from the previous generation. I tried to remember. I went back to the workbench and picked up the notebook again. My father had written further along in the same entry. I called my cousin Ruth in Memphis, who has been working on the Calloway family history for 20 years. She said the initials C, H, C could match a Calloway. My grandfather's father was Caleb Owen Calloway, born 1821, died 1898. He would have been 26 years old in 1847. He had written, "This loom may have been built by my own great-great-grandfather. I don't know how to account for it traveling from a Calloway workshop to the Warfield Mill in Hawkins County and back here to Garnett Creek Road. But if Ruth's research is right about the initials, then this is a Calloway piece coming home." I put the notebook down on the workbench and sat on the stool and did not move for a while. A Calloway piece coming home. My father had driven to Hawkins County on a Wednesday because Meacham had told him to look at a loom. He had crouched at the base of the right upright post and found 3 initials and a date and understood what they meant. He had bought the loom and brought it home to Garnett Creek Road and had spent the better part of a year assessing it and beginning its restoration and had not been able to finish it. And he had written in the 9th notebook, "I think this is the most important piece in the collection and I would like someone who understands it to decide its fate. He had left that to me. I looked at the breast beam with its crack, at the treadles worn smooth by someone's great-great-grandmother's feet, at the heddle frames that needed restringing. The work was not beyond me. I had grown up watching my father work with his hands and had absorbed more than I knew of how he approached things, methodically, without rushing, with attention to the step that came before the step you were on. The specific skills could be learned. Meacham would know who to ask. My father had started from less than this. But first things first. I opened the notebook to the contact list and found Meacham's number. Garrett Meacham answered on the fourth ring with the short, focused greeting of a man who does not have a lot of patience for preamble. When I told him my name, there was a brief pause and then a change in the quality of his voice, not warmer exactly, but less clipped. "Your father told me you'd call," he said. I was starting to understand that this was something my father had arranged deliberately, the way he had arranged everything else. He had told each person in the network to expect me. He had done the introductions before he died. "I'm sorry for your loss," Meacham said. He said it the way people say it when they mean it and don't want to make a performance of meaning it. Then, he was a serious person. "That's not common. What have you seen so far?" I told him I had read the notebooks and the provenance folder. I told him I had been to Sylvia Crane's office. I told him I had spent the morning with the loom. There was a pause. "The Calloway loom," he said. "That's what he called it." "It's what it is," Meacham said. "If the initials and the construction date and the construction methods all align the way your father believed they did, that loom is a documented piece of American craft history with a provenance story that most auction houses would consider exceptional. Pre-Civil War, handmade by a named maker, with a chain of possession that goes from the maker's family to a mill collection to the maker's own descendants. That's not common." I asked him about the finishing work, what remained. He went through it methodically, the same way my father's notes had gone through it. The treadle lashing, the heddle restringing, the breast beam repair, the missing pawl. He said the breast beam repair was the most important and the one that required the most care, that it needed to be stabilized without obscuring the original timber, that he knew a woman in North Carolina who had done exactly this kind of work and had done it for major museum collections. "Adair Holt," he said. "She's been asking about the warping mill, but her actual specialty is structural repair of historic looms, and she would understand the Calloway piece better than almost anyone." I wrote the name on the inside cover of the 9th notebook, which had a clean page at the front. "Ask her to come look at the loom first," Meacham said, "before you commit to anything. Before you talk to the auction house or the museums. Let her see it and tell you what she thinks. She'll be straight with you." I said I'd call her. Then Meacham said, "Your father made a decision about the Sotheby's letter. He told me he hadn't responded and that he wanted you to make that call. I want you to know my opinion for what it's worth." I said I wanted to hear it. "The collection has individual pieces that should go to institutions," he said. "The 1820 wheel in particular belongs in a museum. But the Calloway loom is a different kind of piece. It's not just historically significant. It's personally significant in a way that changes how you think about what to do with it. Selling it to the right buyer could mean it ends up somewhere it can be studied and seen. Keeping it means it stays where it belongs, but stays private. Your father couldn't decide. I think that's why he didn't finish the restoration. He was waiting to understand what he thought." He paused. "The fact that he brought it home from Hawkins County tells you something about what he thought," he said. "But what you do with it is yours." I thanked him and told him I would be in touch. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the mill with the creek running outside and the work lamp casting its clean light over the workbench and the loom visible through the open door of the back room. Then I called Adair Holt. She answered immediately, mid-sentence in another conversation, said hold on, and came back 30 seconds later sounding fully present. I told her my name. I told her about the loom. I described the breast beam crack and the maker's mark and the initials. She was quiet for 3 seconds, which in my experience of people who work with old things is a significant pause. "Your father and I spoke twice," she said. "He told me about the loom, but he wasn't ready to have someone come look at it yet. He said he wanted to finish more of the work himself first." I told her he hadn't been able to. "I know," she said. "I heard. I'm sorry. Can you come?" I said. She was quiet again, a shorter pause this time. "Thursday," she said. "I can be there by 10. I told her I would have the mill open. After I hung up, I sat at the workbench with the coffee, which had gone cold, and made a list. The way my father made lists. Ordered by what had to happen before the next thing could happen. Certified deed copy from the county recorder's office. Done. I could do that today. Contact Meacham. Done. Contact Adair Holt. Done. Read all 9 notebooks fully and make notes on each piece. Not done. I had read them through once, but not with the attention they needed. That was the next day's work. Contact the museum in Georgia about the spinning wheel. After the notebooks. Do not contact Sotheby's until Adair Holt had seen the loom. Do not contact Lorraine. This last item I wrote down and underlined not because I was angry, but because I knew the moment Lorraine understood what was in the mill, the dynamic would change, and I needed to be fully prepared before that change happened. Sylvia had warned me. Meacham, in his way, had warned me. My father had been more oblique about it, but reading between the lines of the letter, the care he had taken to separate and document and record everything, the care was itself a warning. He had anticipated that the value would not remain invisible forever. The county recorder's office was in the courthouse on the main square. I drove there that afternoon and requested the certified copy of the deed. The clerk, a woman in her 50s who had the patient, slightly distant air of someone who has handled the same type of document 10,000 times, looked up the recording number from the information Sylvia had given me, located the file, and made the certified copy. She stamped it and handed it over without ceremony. I held it for a moment in the parking lot. The recording date was 11 months before my father's death. The property description covered the half-acre parcel and the mill structure. My name was on it clearly, Rena Owen Calloway, with my date of birth, the way a deed is written when there is no ambiguity about who the owner is. I put it in the steel box when I got back to the mill. The box was becoming the thing my father had intended it to be, a container for the documents that mattered, the ones that told the true story of what was here and who it belonged to. That evening, back at Cassie's, I went through the notebooks again with more deliberate attention, making notes on each piece, cross-referencing the assessment entries with the photographs and the provenance records. By the time I finished, it was past 11. Cassie had been asleep for 2 hours. The house was quiet. I sat at the table and looked at my notes. The collection, taken as a whole, was more significant than I had understood from reading the letter alone. The letter had given me the outline. The notebooks gave me the depth. Meacham's correspondence, which my father had copied into the 6th and 7th notebooks in detail, gave me the context, the comparative knowledge of what existed elsewhere, and what was rare and what was irreplaceable. The 1820 spinning wheel was the most straightforwardly valuable piece in the conventional market sense. Meacham had identified it as possibly the finest surviving example of a type that had been produced in New England between 1810 and 1835, with construction details suggesting a specific regional workshop tradition that collectors and museums had been trying to document for decades. The provenance was clean. The condition was exceptional. 2 institutions had already expressed serious interest. The small loom with the unusual heddle was of more specialized interest, significant to scholars of early American weaving technology rather than to the broader collector market, but in that narrower category, quite important. The warping mill, which my father had marked keep, was the newest piece in the collection and the most complete. It had been built around 1900 and represented a transitional moment in textile technology, a hand tool of sophisticated design built at the moment when such tools were beginning to be replaced by industrial processes. Its value was partly historical and partly craft, the kind of object that appealed to weavers who worked in historical methods and to collectors with a specific interest in the period. And then the Calloway loom. The more I read, the more I understood what my father had meant. The other pieces were significant. The Calloway loom was something else. If the attribution held, if the initials and the construction date and the methods all confirmed what my father believed, then this was not just a fine historic textile tool. It was a documented piece of family history, a physical connection to a Calloway who had worked this land before the Civil War, who had built something with his hands that had survived 175 years and traveled through other hands and other collections and come back. I thought about the word Meacham had used. Exceptional. He had used it in the context of provenance stories that auction houses considered exceptional, and I had filed it as a technical term, the language of a market. But sitting at Cassie's table with the notebooks spread around me, I understood that exceptional was not just a market word. It was the right word for what my father had found. He had driven to Hawkins County on a Wednesday because a man he trusted had told him to look at a loom, and he had crouched at the base of the right upright post and found 3 initials carved by his own great-great-grandfather, and had understood that he was holding something that had been lost and was now found. He had brought it home. That was the decision he had already made, even if he had not been able to say clearly what happened next. He had brought it home. The rest was mine to figure out. Thursday came cold and clear. Adair Holt arrived at the mill at 10:05 in a truck older than mine, with a camera bag over one shoulder and a kit of tools in the bed. She was in her mid-40s, lean, with the kind of competent hands that identify themselves immediately to anyone who pays attention to hands. She shook mine once, looked at the mill building for a moment, and walked inside. She moved through the main room quickly, pausing at the shelves, reading the labels on the jars, picking up nothing. She went through to the back room and stopped in front of the loom. She stood there for a while without saying anything. I watched her look at the joinery on the crown beam, look at the treadles, crouch at the base of the right upright post, and trace the initials with one finger, the same way I had. She stood up. "How confident was your father about the attribution?" She said. "He had the initials, the date, the construction methods, and a family history that matched the initials," I said. "He hadn't done a formal analysis." She put her hand on the breast beam, on the crack. She pressed gently, testing the flex. "The crack is stable," she said. "It's been stable for a long time. You can see from the dust pattern that it hasn't moved recently. That's good. The repair is delicate but not complicated." She went around the loom slowly, checking each component, lifting the edge of a heddle frame, looking at the warp beam hardware. She did not rush. She had the quality of someone who gives things the time they require. After 20 minutes, she came to the workbench and looked at the notes my father had taped to the base. "He got the assessment right," she said. "The treadle lashing, the heddle restringing, the breast beam, and the pawl. That's the complete list. The frame itself is sound. The wood is remarkable. White oak, old growth, and the drying and seasoning was done correctly when it was made, which is why it's still tight after 175 years. She picked up the 8th notebook from the workbench and opened it to the assessment section. She read for several minutes without speaking. "The Warfield Mill acquisition," she said. "I know the auction. I was there for a different piece. I didn't look at this loom because I wasn't there for looms." She looked up. "I've been in this work for 20 years, and I have not seen a surviving pre-Civil War floor loom with a documented maker's mark and intact original hardware." She said it without drama, just as fact. "Can you finish the restoration?" I said. She looked at the loom again. "Yes," she said. 3 weeks, maybe a little more. The breast beam repair will take whatever time it needs. I won't rush that. Everything else is careful work, but straightforward." I asked her about the cost. She gave me a number. It was a fair number, stated clearly, the number of someone who had thought about it before arriving. Then she said, "I'd like to ask you something before you decide." I told her to go ahead. She looked at the loom. Not at me. At the loom. "Your father and I spoke twice," she said. "The first time was about the warping mill. The second time, about 6 months before he died, he called me about this piece. He described it in detail, and he asked me a question. He asked me what I thought it meant for a family to recover something like this. Something made by their own people that had been lost." She paused. I told him I thought it meant the thing hadn't finished being useful yet. That sometimes objects know where they belong and they... Wait. She looked at me. He said he thought so too. I did not say anything. She said, "I'm not telling you what to decide about it. I just wanted you to know he was thinking about it the same way you're probably thinking about it." I asked what she meant. She looked at the loom again. "The market value of this piece, properly restored, with the attribution confirmed by formal analysis, would be significant. A specialist auction with the right buyers would find it a home in a collection or an institution where it would be preserved and studied. That's a good outcome." "But," she said, "but a loom is not a painting. It's not made to hang still on a wall. It's made to run, to have thread through it and cloth coming off it, and someone's hands working it. A loom that runs tells you things about itself that a loom at rest in a museum case can't tell you." She picked up her camera bag from where she had set it on the workbench. "I'll take photographs today and send you a full assessment by the end of the week," she said. "That will give you everything you need to have the conversation with whoever needs to have it. But I wanted to say that first." I thanked her. She spent another hour photographing the loom from every angle, making measurements, recording the details of the maker's mark. She was quiet and methodical, and she treated the loom with the particular care of someone who has spent a long time with things that are irreplaceable. When she left, she said she would call me Thursday evening. After her truck had gone back down the gravel track, I stood in the back room of the mill alone and looked at the Calloway loom. C. 1847. Caleb Hoke Calloway, 26 years old, building something with white oak and hand tools in a workshop that no longer existed on land that was now someone else's. He had built it well enough that it had outlasted the workshop and the land and the family that used it and 3 generations of hands it had passed through on the way here. My father had found it and brought it home and had not been able to finish what he started. I thought about the 9th notebook. This is the most important piece in the collection, and I would like someone who understands it to decide its fate. I put my hand on the right upright post, near the base, where the initials were. I did not know yet what I was going to decide. But I knew what Adair Holt had said, that a loom is made to run, and I knew what Meacham had said, that the fact my father had brought it home told you something about what he thought, and I knew what my father had written, that he thought I would understand. I was starting to. The call from Lorraine came on the following Tuesday. I had been expecting it, not with certainty about the day, but with the knowledge that it was coming. Sylvia had told me to expect it. The understanding I had reached in the weeks since the will reading was that Lorraine's certainty about the mill's worthlessness had always rested on a foundation of not knowing, and that foundation was not permanent. Information moves in small counties. People talk. Pelham had seen the property mentioned in the will. Meacham existed. Sylvia Crane existed. The county deed records were public. She called at 8 in the morning. I was at the mill, sitting at the workbench with the thermos and the 3rd notebook, going through a section on the provenance of the small heddle loom. Her name came up on the screen, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I picked up. I heard you've been spending time at the mill property, she said. No greeting. No preamble. I have, I said. It's my property. A short pause. Of course, she said. I know that. I'm just surprised you've been out there so much. I wouldn't have thought there was much to do with an old stone building. She said old stone building the way she had said nothing when she held out the key. The same dismissal. But underneath it, this time, something that was not quite certainty. A question she was not asking directly yet. I've been doing some assessment work, I said. Assessment, she repeated. What kind of assessment? I've had some of the contents looked at by a specialist, I said. My father had been working on a collection in the mill for several years. There's quite a bit there. The pause that followed was longer than the others. Collection, she said. What kind of collection? Textile equipment, I said. Historic pieces, some of them quite old. My father restored several of them and documented the rest. A longer pause. I wasn't aware of any collection, she said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, but the tone that had been certain was now something else, a tone recalibrating. He kept it separate, I said. He worked out there on his own time, over the past few years. The documentation is thorough, she said, not unkind, but purposeful, the tone of someone who is about to make a point and has chosen the softer approach first. There may be things in the mill that were purchased during the marriage, assets that would be part of the estate. I was ready for this. Sylvia had told me it was coming and had told me what to say. The pieces in the collection were acquired by my father before and during the marriage using money he had allocated separately for the purpose, I said. The provenance documentation establishes acquisition dates and purchase records for each piece. The collection is thoroughly documented. Another pause. I think we should sit down and talk through this, she said. There may be things that overlap with the estate in ways that weren't clear in the will reading. I agree we should have that conversation, I said. I'd like to have it through our respective attorneys. A silence. She said, softer now. There's no need to make this adversarial. I agree, I said. Which is why I'd like to handle it formally. That way there's no confusion later about what was and wasn't agreed to. I heard the shift in that. She had been setting up the informal conversation, the kitchen table conversation, the this is just between us conversation, and I had named it without naming it. She said she would be in touch, and the call ended. I set the phone down on the workbench and sat for a moment. Through the small window in the north wall, the creek was visible, moving low and clear over its stones. A pair of ducks crossed the pool below the water wheel, unhurried. I called Sylvia Crane. She answered on the second ring, and I told her about the call. She listened without interrupting. I expected this, she said. The phrase assets acquired during the marriage is standard. It's an attempt to create ambiguity where there isn't any. The acquisition records your father kept are the answer to that argument. Each piece has a purchase record with a date, a seller, and a payment source. The payment source matters because he was careful to purchase the collection pieces through a separate account that predated the marriage and was never commingled with joint funds. He was thorough, I said. He was thorough, she confirmed. She paused. I'm going to draft a formal notice to Lorraine's attorney today, confirming the ownership position, confirming that questions about the mill property and its contents should come through this office. That puts the conversation in the right channel before it develops further. I thanked her. She said, one more thing. You said she used the phrase assets acquired during the marriage. That's interesting. I asked why. Because it suggests she knows more about what's in the mill than she did when she handed you that key, she said. Someone told her something. Or she's been looking into it herself. I thought about that. It doesn't change your position, Sylvia said. It just tells you the timeline is moving faster than you might have expected. Get Adair Holt to finish the restoration work as soon as she can. Get Meacham's updated assessment of the collection. And don't make any decisions about the loom until you have everything in writing. I said I understood. She said, your father knew she would look twice at some point. That's why he built everything the way he did. He wanted you to be standing on solid ground when she looked. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and went back to the third notebook. I was on solid ground. The deed was recorded. The provenance was documented. The attorney was engaged. Adair Holt was coming back next week to begin the restoration work. Meacham had agreed to provide a written assessment of the collection's value, current market figures, by the end of the month. But Sylvia was right that the timeline was moving. Lorraine had gone from nothing to the word collection in 6 days. She would get to the word value soon enough. I needed Adair Holt's assessment and Meacham's figures before that happened. I called Adair Holt that evening and told her I wanted to move forward. She said she could start Monday. I told her I would have the mill open. I also, that evening, wrote a letter to the museum in Georgia. My father had the contact in the folder, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wren in the textile arts department. I had drafted the letter twice in my head before I wrote it, the same way my father would have done, getting the wording right before committing it to the page. I told her who I was. I told her that my father had been in correspondence with her about the 1820 spinning wheel. I told her the collection was now under my care and that I was in the process of having the pieces formally assessed, and that I would be in contact when I was ready to discuss the wheel. I asked if her interest was current. She replied the next morning in a message that was 3 sentences long and professional, in exactly the way that confirms someone has been waiting for a specific communication. The museum's interest was very much current. Dr. Wren asked if she could come to see the piece in person and name a preferred timeline. I wrote back and said I would let her know once my assessment work was complete and that I expected that to be within the month. She replied with a single line. We will await your word with great interest. I showed that message to Cassie at breakfast. Cassie read it and set the phone down and looked at me. Your dad built you a very careful thing, she said. He did, I said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the frost had come again, the 3rd morning in a row. The field behind her house was white and still. Are you going to sell the loom? She said. I don't know yet, I said. I need to hear what Adair says. She nodded. She did not push. She had the quality of not pushing when not pushing was what was needed, which was most of the time. I told her about the maker's mark. About Caleb Hope Calloway, 26 years old, 1847. About my father driving to Hawkins County on a Wednesday and finding 3 initials carved into the base of a loom and understanding what they meant. Cassie was quiet for a moment. That's the reason he couldn't sell it, she said. Not the market value. He couldn't sell it because it was his family. I thought about that. He could have sold it, I said. He didn't say he wouldn't. He said he didn't know. She nodded. That's the same thing, for some people. Maybe, I said. But it was also true that he had brought it home. He had driven to Hawkins County and looked at a loom and recognized it as something that belonged to the family and had brought it home to Garnett Creek Road. That was a decision. Even if he hadn't been able to decide what came next, that first decision had been made. I thought about the creek bank, standing there the first morning with the November air clean and cold and the water running over the flat stones. I thought about the way the mill sat in the clearing with the sycamores around it, the stone warming in the morning sun, the water wheel patient on the north side. My grandfather had built this mill. His grandfather had built the loom that was now in the back room. 3 generations of people who had worked this land and made things with their hands and kept what they built and passed it forward. The keeping was the thing. The passing forward was the thing. Adair Holt arrived Monday at 9 in the morning with a full set of tools and a focused quiet that was the signature of someone who knows what they are there to do. She set up in the back room efficiently, moving the other pieces slightly to give herself working room, draping the warping mill and the spinning wheel in fresh cloth to protect them from dust. She began with the breast beam. I watched her work for the first hour, not hovering, just present, understanding that watching was part of my education. She worked with a set of small clamps and a consolidant. She mixed herself from a recipe she could quote from memory, a recipe developed by a conservator at a major museum who had been her teacher. She applied it with a brush no wider than a finger, working it into the crack from both sides, patient and exact. She said, without looking up, "Your father was right that the crack was stable. But stable doesn't mean it would have stayed stable under tension. If you'd put a warp on this loom without repairing it first, you'd have lost the beam." I asked if it would hold now. She said, "When I'm done, it'll hold for another 100 years. She worked on the breast beam for 3 days. She did not rush it. On the 4th day, she moved to the treadle lashing and showed me how the original had been done, the pattern of the lashing, the logic of it, so that I could see how the function determined the form. She talked while she worked, not constantly, but in the way of someone who believes that passing knowledge along is part of the work itself. She told me about the woman who had taught her, the conservator in Boston who had worked on loom restoration for 30 years and who had said once that every loom you restore is a letter to someone in the future. You don't know who, but you do the work on the assumption that someone is going to use what you've fixed, and your job is to make sure the letter is legible. I thought about my father, taping notes to the base of the loom in June, the handwriting already difficult, already slowing, writing down what remained to be done so that whoever came next would have a clear starting point. His letter had been legible. On the 6th day of Adair's work, Meacham sent his written assessment. I opened it at the workbench while Adair worked on the heddle frames in the back room. The assessment was formal, typed, with comparative sale data and footnotes. He had assessed each piece in the collection individually and provided current market value ranges for those he considered ready for market. The 1820 spinning wheel, he wrote, was in his professional opinion one of the most significant surviving examples of its type. He named 2 comparable pieces that had sold at auction in the past 5 years and provided the sale figures. The range he gave for the wheel was at the higher end of what my father's notebooks had projected, which meant the market had moved in the direction my father had anticipated. The small heddle loom he assessed more conservatively, noting that its market was specialized. But the figure he gave was still substantial. The warping mill he noted as my father had marked it, a piece of transitional period significance with a strong market among serious collectors of working textile equipment. And then, at the end of the assessment, a section on the Calloway loom. He had written, "The large frame floor loom acquired from the Warfield Mill collection is, in my professional opinion, the most significant piece in the Calloway collection. If the attribution to Caleb Hoke Calloway, 1847, is confirmed by formal analysis, which I believe it will be, this piece represents an exceptionally rare surviving example of a pre-Civil War American craftsman-made floor loom with documented maker identification. The combination of physical evidence, family history documentation, and chain of possession creates a provenance narrative that is, in my 23 years of experience in this field, genuinely unusual." He gave a range. The lower end was already more than I had been prepared for. The upper end, he noted, was contingent on the formal attribution analysis and on the restoration being completed to the standard Adair Holt was known for, which he had no reason to doubt. I read the upper end twice. I folded the assessment and put it in the steel box. Then I went back to the back room where Adair was working and stood in the doorway and washed her hands on the heddle frame for a while. She looked up. I said, "Meacham sent his assessment." She nodded once, reading my face. I said, "The loom. The upper range." She waited. I said the number. She went back to the heddle frame. "That's about right," she said, "given the attribution." I stood in the doorway of the back room with the creek outside and the work lamp's clean light on the old oak frame and thought about my father driving to Hawkins County on a Wednesday. I thought about Lorraine in the hallway, holding the key at arm's length. She had given me the key to a stone building on a creek that she had decided was nothing. She had been wrong about what she was holding. I was starting to understand the full shape of how wrong. Adair finished the restoration on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after she had arrived. She did not announce it. She came out of the back room in the early afternoon, set her tools on the workbench in the order she always set them, washed her hands in the basin I had set up near the door, and said it the way she said most things, without ceremony, as a fact delivered to someone who could be trusted to receive it plainly. "It's done," she said. "Come look." I followed her into the back room. The loom stood the way it had always stood, floor to ceiling, the 4 oak posts rising to the crown beam, the frame hand-pegged and tight. But it was different now in the way that a repaired thing is. Different from a broken one, not in appearance so much as in presence. The breast beam was whole. The treadles were relashed in the original pattern Adair had reconstructed from the wear marks on the old cord. The heddle frames were restrung, the heddles hanging even and clean. The warp beam turned smoothly on its pawl, the replacement piece she had sourced from a hardware supplier in Vermont and fitted to match the original hardware exactly. The loom looked like what it was, a tool made to be used, restored to the condition in which it could be used again. Adair stood beside me, and we looked at it together. 175 years, she said. Give or take. Give or take, I said. She picked up her camera and took the final documentation photographs, working around the loom in the methodical way she always worked, making sure every angle was recorded. When she finished, she downloaded the photographs to her laptop and put together the restoration report on the spot, sitting at the workbench with the focused efficiency of someone who understands that a job is not complete until the paperwork is complete. She handed me the printed report. I said, "Before you go, I want to ask you something." She waited. I said, "You told me a loom is made to run, not to sit in a museum case." She said nothing. She was watching me. I said, "If I were to put a warp on this loom, is it ready for that?" She looked at the loom. A long look. "It is," she said. "It is exactly ready for that." She drove back to North Carolina that afternoon, and I stood in the back room of the mill alone with the Calloway loom and the question of what came next. The question had been with me since the first morning, since I had crouched at the base of the right upright post and found the initials. It had been with me through the 9 notebooks and the assessment and Meacham's written figures and Lorraine's phone call and Sylvia's formal notice. I had been carrying it the way you carry a question that has no simple answer, not because the answer is unknown, but because the answer is complicated and requires you to know what you want before you can say what you are going to do. I sat down on the low stool my father had kept in the back room, the one he had used when he was working close to the ground, and I thought about the number Meacham had given me. At the upper end, sold to the right buyer with the attribution confirmed, the Calloway loom was worth more than I had earned in the last 3 years combined. More than enough to address the immediate practical problems. More than enough to secure time, which was what I needed most, time to work through the rest of the collection thoughtfully rather than urgently. But Adair had said a loom is made to run. And my father had written, "This is the most important piece in the collection, and I would like someone who understands it to decide its fate." I looked at the loom. The treadles worn smooth. The breast beam whole. The heddles hanging even in the clean light of the work lamp. Caleb Hoke Calloway had built this in 1847 with white oak and hand tools and the knowledge of a craftsman who understood that the thing he was making should outlast him. He had built it well enough that it had. He had not known it would travel to Hawkins County and sit in the Warfield mill for a century and be auctioned in 2018 and end up in a stone building on Garnett Creek Road being examined by his great-great-granddaughter in the November of 2022. But here it was. I put my hand on the breast beam, on the place where the crack had been, where Adair's repair had made it whole. The wood was smooth and warm under my palm in the way that old wood is warm, the way it holds the temperature of the room rather than the cold of the air. I knew what I was going to do. I had known since Adair had said a loom is made to run, or perhaps earlier, since I had read my father's last notebook entry, since he had written that she was always better with her hands than she gives herself credit for. But there were things to do before I could do what I knew I was going to do, and they needed to be done in the right order. I called Meacham first. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him I had a decision about the loom. He was quiet, waiting. "I'm not selling it," I said. A pause. Not surprised. Thoughtful. He said, "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to learn to use it," I said. "And I'm going to use it." Another pause. "Your father would say that's the right answer," he said. "I think he already said it," I said. "He just didn't say it in so many words." Meacham was quiet for a moment. Then, the other pieces. The wheel. The Heddle Loom. I want to sell the 1820 Wilda Drive Wren's museum, I said. I've read everything my father wrote about it, and I think he was right that it belongs somewhere it can be studied. The Heddle Loom I'm going to think about longer. The warping mill stays. He said, that's a sound plan. Do you want me to facilitate the conversation with the museum? I said I could handle it directly, but that I would like him to be available if questions arose about the provenance documentation. He said he would. Then he said, the Sotheby's letter. I said, I'll write to them. The will can go through their textile specialist if the museum conversation doesn't develop. But I expect it will. He said, your father spent 3 years building this. You've spent 3 weeks understanding it. I want you to know that's not slow. That's exactly the right pace. I thanked him. After I hung up, I sat for another moment in the quiet of the back room. Then I took out the notebook and wrote down the next list. Contact Dr. Wren. Confirm interest, arrange visit. Not done. Contact Sylvia about the formal notice and the status of Lorraine's attorney response. Not done. Source materials for the first warp. Not done. Call Adair about the weaving, about where to start learning. Not done. The list was longer than the previous ones had been. That was right. The previous lists had been about establishing a foundation. This list was about building something on it. I wrote one more line at the bottom. Tell Cassie. I drove to Dr. Wren's museum 2 weeks later. The museum was in the north part of Atlanta, a converted warehouse building in a neighborhood that had held textile mills in the previous century and now held galleries and studios and the particular creative industry that settles in old industrial spaces. Dr. Wren met me in the lobby, a compact woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the focused energy of someone who does not waste professional meetings on pleasantries, but is genuinely warm once the work begins. She had already seen the photographs. Meacham had sent her the assessment. She had read the provenance documentation. She took me to the textile storage room, which was not the museum floor, but the working archive where the collection lived in climate-controlled drawers and shelving, and she showed me what they had from the period my father's will came from. 2 comparable wheels, both significant, neither in the condition of the Calloway collection piece. She put the photographs of my father's wheel on the table between us. He documented this meticulously, she said. The acquisition record, the condition assessment, the restoration notes. This is exactly what we need. I told her about the initials on the loan. The C. H. C. Not the wheel. I was not selling the wheel as a family piece. It was a fine historic object from the right period and the right region, and that was the story it told. But I wanted her to understand the context of the collection, what my father had been building, why he had assembled these pieces with such care. She listened. She asked questions that were specific and knowledgeable, the questions of someone who understood the period and the technology and the significance. At the end of the meeting, she said, we want this wheel. The price your consultant quoted is within our acquisition budget. I'd like to bring our board a proposal at our next meeting, which is in 3 weeks. I said that worked for my timeline. She said, can I ask you something personal? I said yes. She said, your father assembled this collection over 3 years while he was ill. He documented it to a standard that most private collectors don't achieve. He set up the legal and financial structure to protect it. And then he left it to you without explanation until you found your way to the mill. She paused. Why do you think he didn't just tell you? I had thought about this. I had thought about it in the car on the drive down, and in the evenings at Cassie's house, and in the back room of the mill sitting with the loom. I think he wanted me to find it, I said, not just receive it. There's a difference between being handed something and discovering something. He knew me well enough to know that if I discovered it, I would understand it in a way I couldn't if he just explained it to me. She nodded. I also think, I said, he was not entirely sure what it was himself until the end. The loom in particular. He spent the last year of his life trying to understand what he had found and what it meant, and he hadn't finished that process when he died. He left me the material so I could finish it. She looked at the photographs of the wheel on the table between us. He trusted you with a complicated thing, she said. He did, I said. She walked me out to the lobby and shook my hand at the door. 3 weeks, she said. You'll hear from me. I drove back through Georgia into Tennessee with the afternoon light moving across the fields and the radio off, and I thought about what she had said. He trusted you with a complicated thing. He had, and the trust was not blind. He had built the documentation and the legal structure and the network precisely so that the trust had a foundation. He had not left me a complicated thing and said figure it out alone. He had left me a complicated thing and said, here are the tools you need, and here are the people who can help you, and here is the structure that will protect you, and I believe you will know what to do when you understand what you have. The trust was built on something. That was the difference. I was home before dark. Lorraine's attorney response arrived the following Monday, delivered to Sylvia Crane's office. Sylvia called me that afternoon. She said, as I expected, the response identifies several items they are claiming were acquired with marital funds and constitute estate assets. They have named 3 specific pieces. I asked which 3. The warping mill, the small heddle loom, and the large frame loom, she said. I was quiet for a moment. Not the spinning wheel, I said. Not the spinning wheel, she confirmed. They may not know about it, or they may have done enough research to understand it was acquired before the marriage and decided not to include it. The 3 they named were acquired later. I asked about the documentation. The acquisition records for all 3 show purchase from clearly documented sources, she said. The warping mill was purchased at a rural auction 3 years ago. The heddle loom came from a private seller in Kentucky. The loom came from the Warfield Mill auction in 2018. All 3 predate Lorraine's interest in this property by years. But, I said, knowing there was a but. The payment documentation is less clear for 2 of the 3, she said. The account your father used for collection purchases was, as I told you, a separate account. But there are 2 transfers from the joint account to the separate account in the period when the warping mill and the heddle loom were acquired, and their attorney is arguing those transfers represent marital funds being used for the purchases. I thought about this. Were the transfers before or after the purchases? I said, before, she said, which is the less favorable scenario. If the transfers had come after, they would be harder to characterize as purchase funding. What's your assessment? I said. She was quiet for a moment. I think we win this, she said. The transfers were for amounts that were part of a regular pattern of your father moving money between accounts, not specifically timed to the purchases. The purchase records show payment from the separate account. The argument their attorney is making requires a chain of inference that the documentation doesn't fully support. But it will take time and possibly a hearing to resolve it formally, she said, which is what they are counting on. The goal is not necessarily to win. The goal is to make the process expensive and slow enough that you consider settling. I thought about the number Meacham had given me for the loom. The upper end. What would settling mean? I said, a payment, she said. A portion of the appraised value of the disputed pieces, in exchange for releasing any claim. I said, how much are we talking about? She gave me a range. I was quiet. She said, I know that's not a number you want to hear. It's not, I said, but it's a number I can think about. Don't think about it yet, she said. Let me respond to their letter first. I want to put our documentation in front of their attorney formally. The complete acquisition records, the account history, the pattern of transfers, the purchase receipts. I want them to understand what they're actually arguing against before you make any decisions about settlement. She said, sometimes when an attorney sees the full picture, they advise their client to reconsider. Lorraine may not know how thorough your father's records are. She almost certainly did not, I thought. She had handed me the key without knowing what she was handing me. She had looked at the mill and seen an old stone building on a creek. She was still looking at it the same way, just with different eyes now. The eyes of someone who had learned that old stone buildings on creeks could contain something worth arguing about. But she still did not know the full picture. I asked Sylvia to respond to the letter. In the 2 weeks that followed, I went to the mill every morning. Adair had left me a reading list before she drove back to North Carolina, a set of references on handloom weaving technique and the specific mechanics of the type of loom the Calloway piece was. And I worked through the list in the evenings at Cassie's and spent the mornings at the mill with the loom itself, learning its parts and their relationship to each other. The way the treadles connected to the lambs, and the lambs to the heddle frames, and the heddle frames to the warp. I had also, on Adair's recommendation, ordered my first set of materials. Wool yarn, undyed, the kind used for sampling before a serious project. Enough for a small warp, 10 yards, a narrow width. Enough to understand what the loom did and how it felt to work it without committing to a finished piece. The yarn arrived on a Thursday. I brought it to the mill on a Friday morning and set it on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Then I opened the 7th notebook, the one with the most detailed description of the loom's mechanics, and I began. Warping was the first step. I had read about it and watched a video on Cassie's laptop 3 times, and still the first warp I measured was too loose and had to be redone. The second was better. The third was right, or close enough to write that Adair, when I photographed it and sent it to her, said it will do for a first warp. Threading the heddles took the better part of a morning. The loom had 4 harnesses, each one threaded in sequence, the pattern determining what kind of cloth the loom would produce. I was learning the simplest threading pattern, a plain weave, the most basic structure, the one that was the foundation of everything else. It took me 2 hours to thread the heddles. My father had written in the 8th notebook, in a section where he was speculating about what the loom had been used for. A loom this size, with 4 harnesses, would have been capable of fairly complex patterns. The wear on the treadles suggests it was used heavily and regularly. Someone sat at this loom for years. Someone had. And now I was sitting at it, or rather standing in front of it with my hands in the heddles, learning the work from the beginning the way you learn anything that requires practice, by doing it badly at first and attending to why it was bad and doing it again. Sylvia's response to Lorraine's attorney went out on a Wednesday. She sent me a copy. It was 4 pages, formal and precise, the language of someone who has built a case carefully and is presenting it without excess. She documented the acquisition history of each disputed piece, the dates, the sellers, the payment records. She documented the account history, showing the pattern of transfers between accounts over the full course of the marriage, demonstrating that the specific transfers their attorney had identified were part of a regular pattern unconnected to specific purchases. She included Meacham's written assessment as an exhibit, establishing the current value of the pieces and the provenance of each. And at the end, a section I had not expected. She had included a brief history of the Calloway mill property, the deed transferred to me, and the documented history of my father's work at the mill over the 3 years before his death. She had written that the collection was not a windfall acquisition made during the marriage, but the product of a 3-year restoration project conducted by Owen Calloway on property he had been maintaining for decades, using skills and knowledge developed over a lifetime, with the clear intention of leaving the collection to his daughter. The collection, she wrote, reflects the labor and attention of its creator. It is not an asset that can be extracted from that history without distorting what it is. I read that sentence twice. Cassie read the letter over my shoulder at the kitchen table that evening. She said, "Your lawyer is good." "She is," I said. She said, "Lorraine is going to have to look at that and understand she's not just arguing about money. She's arguing about your father's work." "That's what Sylvia wanted her to understand," I said. Cassie was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she knew?" She said, "When she handed you the key, do you think she understood on some level that there was more there than she was letting on?" I had thought about this. "No," I said. "I think she genuinely believed it was nothing. I think she handed me the key because dismissing the mill was the easiest way to dismiss me, and she had been doing that for 9 years without it costing her anything." She looked at the letter. "Until now," she said. "Until now," I said. The response from Lorraine's attorney came 10 days later. Sylvia called me when it arrived. She said, "They're withdrawing the claim on the loom." I was quiet. "They're maintaining the claim on the warping mill and the heddle loom," she said. "But they've dropped the loom." "Why?" I said, though I thought I knew. She said, "The attribution. The Calloway loom documentation, the maker's mark, the family history, the Meacham analysis. Their attorney has advised Lorraine that arguing that a loom made by Owen Calloway's own great-great-grandfather is a marital asset is a factual and optics problem they don't want to take in front of a judge." I thought about that. The initials in the wood. C. H. C. 1847. My father had found them and understood what they meant, and now those 3 letters were the answer to a legal argument. Caleb Hope Calloway had built his mark into his work, and that mark had come home, and it had done something he could not have anticipated. It had protected something. Sylvia said, "The remaining claims on the warping mill and the heddle loom I believe we can resolve. I want to propose a mediated conversation rather than a formal hearing. With the documentation we have, I think their attorney will advise Lorraine to settle for a modest sum rather than litigate. The cost of litigation relative to the value of the pieces doesn't support the fight." I asked her what modest meant. She gave me a figure. It was in the lower range of what she had described earlier as the settlement possibility. It was a number I could manage, particularly given what the museum conversation was likely to produce. "Do it," I said. She said she would arrange the mediation. After I hung up, I sat at the workbench in the mill with the loom visible in the back room through the open door, and I thought about the word modest. It was the right word for what Lorraine was going to get from this. Modest. A modest sum for a modest claim that had never had the foundation she thought it had. She had handed me a key to a stone building on a creek and believed she was giving me nothing. What she had actually done was release the grip that might have made things difficult, the 9 years of quiet management and rearrangement, the practiced patience with which she had positioned herself in my father's life and his house and his estate. She had let go of the mill because she was certain it was worthless. The certainty had been the error, not a malicious error, not a calculated one, just the error of a person who measures the value of things by what they look like from the outside and does not look further. My father had known she would not look further. Dr. Wren called on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after our meeting. She said, "Our board approved the acquisition. We'd like to move forward." I said I was glad. She said, "I want to tell you something. As a professional in this field, the documentation your father created for this collection is exceptional. We've acquired pieces from private collections for 30 years, and I have never seen a private collector assemble provenance documentation at this level of completeness. It made our acquisition committee's work straightforward." I said that was what he had intended. She said, "He was protecting it, wasn't he? Not just for you, for the object itself." I said, "I think so. He understood that the value of these things isn't just market value. It's what they carry, and what they carry needs to be documented or it can be lost." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The wheel is going into the permanent collection. It will be on display. And the provenance story, the Calloway collection, the restoration, your father's work, will be part of the interpretive materials. His name will be on the wall," she said. I had not expected that. I was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that all right?" I said, "Yes. That's more than all right." The mediation happened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room in the county seat, a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air, the kind of room where neutral things are meant to happen. Sylvia sat beside me. Lorraine's attorney, a man named Garfield who had the careful manner of someone who knew his client's position was not as strong as she believed, sat across from us with Lorraine beside him. Lorraine looked the same as she always looked. Composed. The dark hair, the careful posture, the expression of a person who has decided before entering a room what outcome is acceptable. She looked at me once when we sat down, and then looked at the table. Garfield presented the reduced claim, the warping mill and the Heddle loom, the funds argument, the transfers. Sylvia responded. I had heard the arguments already, and I let the formal presentation move without interrupting it, watching Lorraine instead. At some point in the presentation, Lorraine heard something in Sylvia's response that changed something in her face. I was not certain what it was. It might have been the account history documentation, the careful record of the pattern of transfers over 9 years that showed, clearly and without drama, that the money was not specifically tied to any purchase. It might have been the exhibit with Meacham's assessment, the professional figures, the formal language of someone with 23 years in the field. Or it might have been the paragraph Sylvia had written in the original response, the sentence that said the collection reflects the labor and attention of its creator. Lorraine sat with that in front of her and looked at it, and her face did the thing that faces do when a person is revising a belief they have held for a long time. The revised belief was not dramatic. It did not produce tears or an apology or a scene. Lorraine was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of moment. But something shifted in her posture, just slightly, the controlled alignment relaxing by a degree, and she said something quietly to Garfield, and Garfield said something to Sylvia, and the figure came down further than Sylvia had projected. We settled for less than the lower end of Sylvia's range. I wrote the check in the conference room. Lorraine took it without looking at it, and put it in her bag, and stood up, and Garfield began the paperwork. She looked at me once more before she left. I did not look away. She said, "He spent a lot of time out there." "He did," I said. She said, "I never understood why." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the 9th notebook, about the entry where he had written that the mill was not just a plan, that it was a place he was glad to have, that the work there was his, and it was good, and it mattered to him. He needed somewhere that was his, I said. She looked at me. Something in her expression that was not quite regret and not quite recognition, but was in the territory between them. Then she said, "He left it to the right person." She walked out and Garfield finished the paperwork and Sylvia and I sat in the conference room after everyone else had gone and Sylvia said it would take a week to process and then the claims would be formally released. I'm glad, I said. She said, your father would be pleased. I think he would, I said. She gathered her papers. She had the quiet efficiency of someone who has done a good thing and has no need to make more of it than it is. At the door, she said, come back and see me when you're ready to think about the long-term structure. The mill property, the collection, what remains. There are planning questions worth addressing now that the immediate situation is resolved. I said I would. She said, he said once, near the end, that he wasn't leaving you a fortune. He said he was leaving you a foundation. She said it without elaboration and walked out, and I sat alone in the conference room for a moment with the cleared table in front of me, and the recycled air, and the carpet cleaner smell, and the particular quiet of a room where a thing has been decided. A foundation. I drove back to the mill. It was a January afternoon, the sky the low white of midwinter, the kind of sky that holds the light in instead of releasing it. The sycamores on Garnett Creek Road were bare and gray, and the creek was high from the rain earlier in the week, running fast and brown over the stones. I parked in the clearing and sat in the car for a moment looking at the mill. The stone building. The water wheel on the north side. The tin roof over the old slate. The door of heavy wood and iron, sitting flush in the wall the way it had sat for as long as the building had stood. I had been coming here every day for 2 months. I knew the sound the door made when you pushed it open, the particular creak of the iron hinges and the solid thud of the wood. I knew the way the light came through the small windows in the morning, and the way the stone held the cold, and the way the creak sounded from the back room, constant and indifferent and clean. I went inside. The mill was as I had left it that morning, the work lamp on its hook, the notebooks on the workbench, the steel box, its hasp still open. In the back room, the loom. I had put on the first warp 3 weeks ago. A narrow warp, 10 yards, the plain weave threading I had learned from Adair's reading list, and from an afternoon on the phone with Adair herself, when the threading had gone wrong in a way I could not diagnose, and she had talked me through it with the patient clarity of someone who has explained the same problem 40 times and has found the exact words that make it legible. The first warp had produced 8 yards of plain cloth before I cut it off the loom. The cloth was uneven, the beat inconsistent, the selvages ragged on the right side where my right hand had not yet found the right tension on the shuttle. It was the cloth of someone who is learning, not the cloth of someone who knows what they are doing. I had rolled it up and set it on the shelf in the back room. Then I had put on the second warp. The second warp was better. The beat was more consistent. The selvages were still imperfect, but improving, the right side tightening as my hand learned the shuttle's weight. I had been weaving on the second warp for a week, a few hours each morning, the rhythm of the treadles, and the shuttle finding its pace the way rhythms find their pace when you give them time. I went to the back room and sat down at the loom. The treadle sequence came back immediately, the muscle memory already starting to form after 2 weeks of the same motion. Left foot, right foot, throw the shuttle, beat. Left foot, right foot, throw the shuttle, beat. The cloth grew off the breast beam and wound onto the cloth beam below, yard by yard, the plain weave building itself one shot at a time. My father had written in the 8th notebook, in the last entry before the handwriting became too difficult, I would like to see this loom running again. I think about what it would have been like in 1847, the sound of it in whatever room it was built for, the cloth coming off it, the practical fact of it. Someone needed cloth, and someone knew how to make it, and someone built the tool to make it. That chain of necessity and skill is one of the oldest chains there is. He had not been able to finish the restoration. He had not been able to see it running. I thought about that as the shuttle moved through the shed and the treadles rose and fell, and the cloth built itself on the loom that Caleb Hope Calloway had made with white oak and hand tools in 1847 in a workshop that no longer existed on land that was now someone else's. The loom had survived him and the workshop and the land and 3 generations of other hands and a sale in 2018 and a drive to Garnett Creek Road and a restoration and a legal argument, and it was running now. My foot on the treadle was on the wood his hands had made. That was not nothing. That was the opposite of nothing. The cloth that was growing on the loom that afternoon was the cloth of someone still learning, uneven and imperfect, the work of the beginning of a thing rather than the middle or the end. But it was real cloth, woven on a real loom, and the loom was whole, and the breast beam was repaired, and the heddles were even, and the treadles were relashed in the original pattern, and the warp beam turned on its pawl. I wove until the light changed in the north window, the low January afternoon going from white to gray, the creak sounds steady outside. Then I wound the cloth beam a turn, checked the warp tension, and stopped. I looked at the cloth. It was getting better. Not good yet, but getting there. The right selvage was closer to even than it had been a week ago. The beat was more consistent through the middle section. I could see the improvement in the cloth the way you can see improvement in anything that you attend to daily, not dramatically, not all at once, but accumulating. Adair had told me on the phone, give it 6 months. By 6 months you will be making cloth you are proud of. 6 months. I had 4.5 to go. I covered the loom with its cloth, the one I had made for it from a bolt of muslin, and turned off the work lamp and locked the mill and walked to the car. The clearing was gray in the January light. The water wheel on the north side of the mill was still, the way it had been still for 50 years, the wood dark and patient. I had been thinking about the water wheel. Adair knew a millwright, a man in Kentucky who restored historic water-powered equipment. She had mentioned him once in passing. I had written his name down. The water wheel was a longer project. A project for a later list. For now, there was the cloth on the loom and the museum conversation with Dr. Wren moving toward completion and Sylvia's planning conversation still ahead and the 9 notebooks on the workbench and the steel box with the deed in it. The deed that said this was mine. I sat in the car with the engine off for a moment, looking at the mill. My father had needed this place, and he had made sure I could keep it. The work he had done out here in the last 3 years of his life, slowly, with a tremor in his right hand and the illness working on him quietly, had been for 2 things at once. It had been for me, the documentation and the legal structure and the network and the plan. But it had also been for him, the place where the decisions were still his and the work was still good and the quiet was the kind of quiet he needed. He had needed it, and he had left it to me, and I needed it too, though I was only beginning to understand how much. The inheritance was not the machines, or the provenance records, or the figures in Meacham's assessment. The inheritance was this: the understanding that the worth of a thing is not what it looks like from the road. The understanding that patient work done with attention builds something real even when no one is watching. The understanding that what you make with your hands and what you care for and what you restore and what you pass forward is a kind of statement about who you are and what you believe matters. My father had made that statement for 3 years in a stone building on a creek while the illness worked on him. He had made it carefully and without audience, and he had trusted that I would find it and understand it. I had found it. I was beginning to understand it. There was cloth on the Calloway loom. The mill was standing on Garnett Creek Road the way it had stood for 90 years, the stone holding the cold, the water wheel patient on the north side, the creek running over its stones toward the river. My name was on the deed. The notebooks were on the shelf. The steel box was open. Lorraine had handed me the key to a stone building on a creek and told me it was nothing. She had been wrong in every direction. Wrong about what was inside it. Wrong about what it was worth. Wrong, in the end, about whether it was hers to dismiss. My father had spent 3 years making sure she was wrong. He had done it quietly, without confrontation, without a single word to anyone who would have made it a fight. He had just worked, steadily and carefully, one piece at a time, building the thing he wanted to leave and making certain it would hold. It was holding. I started the car and drove back down Garnett Creek Road under the bare sycamores, and behind me the mill sat in the clearing the way it always sat, the stone building on the creek, patient and whole, waiting for the morning. My father had not left me a worthless mill. He had left me the understanding that nothing my father touched was ever truly worthless. He had left me a place that was mine in a way that nothing had been mine since I was 7 years old and my mother was still alive and the world was still the size of a kitchen and a backyard. He had left me work that was real and a foundation that was solid and a network of people who had been watching for me and waiting for me to call. He had left me the loom, and the loom was running. That was enough to start with. And from what I had learned about the way things build when you attend to them carefully, it was more than enough. It was the beginning of something I could not yet see the end of, something that would take years to understand fully and longer than that to make properly. But I was not in a hurry. My father had not been in a hurry either. He had driven to Hawkins County on a Wednesday because a man he trusted had told him to look at a loom, and he had found 3 initials carved into white oak by a Calloway who had been dead for 120 years, and he had understood what it meant, and he had brought it home. You bring home what belongs to you. You restore what has been broken. You pass forward what you have been given. That was what he had done. That was what I was going to do. The creek ran on behind me, steady and clear over the flat stones, the sound of water that has been moving for longer than anyone can remember and will keep moving long after the stone buildings on its banks have been forgotten and built again by other hands with other names who understand, in the particular way that people who work with their hands always understand, that what you make is never really finished. It just becomes something else, something that belongs to whoever comes next. The museum check arrived in February, on a Tuesday, in an envelope with the Georgia return address and the museum's name in small clean letters in the upper left corner. I had been expecting it. Dr. Wren had called the previous Friday to confirm the transfer was processing and that the wheel would be collected the following week by a specialist shipper they used for fragile acquisitions. She said the interpretive panel for the permanent collection display was in draft and that she would send me a copy before it was finalized, because she wanted to make sure the language about my father was right. I held the envelope for a moment at the mill workbench before I opened it, not from hesitation, from the desire to mark the moment. The way you pause before opening something that closes one chapter and opens another. The figure on the check matched what Dr. Wren and I had agreed on. It was the figure Meacham had projected at the lower end of his range, which was where I had priced it deliberately. Not because I needed to undersell it, but because I wanted the museum to be able to acquire it cleanly, without a board fight over the budget, without the negotiation that happens when a seller pushes to the top of the range and a buyer has to find reasons to resist. My father had written in the 6th notebook, in a section about the ethics of selling historic objects, the right buyer at the right price is worth more than the highest price from the wrong buyer. A piece sold to someone who will use it well is worth more than the same piece sold to someone who will store it. I deposited the check that afternoon and sat with the numbers for an evening. The settlement with Lorraine had been paid. The restoration work, Adair's fee, and the materials and the sourcing costs had been paid. What remained after those obligations was enough to cover a year of modest living, the mill's maintenance and property taxes, and the materials for the next 2 warps. It was not a fortune. It was a foundation. I called Cassie that evening and told her the check had arrived. She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. "It feels like the beginning of something," I said. "Not the end." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the right answer," she said. The wheel was collected the following Thursday. The shipper arrived in a van with custom foam packaging and 2 people who handled the wheel with the practiced care of professionals who understand that the objects they move are irreplaceable. They wrapped it and crated it and loaded it and drove away down Garnett Creek Road, and I stood in the clearing and watched the van until it turned onto the county road and disappeared. I went back inside. The shelf where the wheel had stood held its absence cleanly. The space it left was not empty in the way of something missing. It was empty in the way of something completed, a task that had reached its conclusion, a question that had been answered. The warping mill was still on its shelf. The heddle loom, the hay press in the far corner that I had not yet fully assessed. And in the back room, the Calloway loom with its 2nd warp still on it, the cloth half done, waiting for morning. I sat at the workbench and opened the notebook I had started for myself, separate from my father's 9, a 10th notebook in a different color, red where his had been blue. I had begun it the week I put on the 1st warp. In it I kept my own records, the warp specifications, the threading sequences, the notes on what had gone wrong and what had gone better and what I was trying next. I wrote the date in a single line. The wheel is gone. The loom is here. This is the work now. Spring came slowly to the bottomland, the way it always does in the creek valleys, later than everywhere else because the cold air pools and holds, and the frost stays on the low ground long after it has left the ridges. But by March the river birch on the far bank were showing green, and the sycamores on Garnett Creek Road were budding, and the light in the mill shifted from the flat white of winter to something warmer and more directional, coming through the north window at an angle that moved across the floor as the morning progressed. I had been weaving every morning for 6 weeks. The 2nd warp was done and cut off and rolled. The 3rd warp was on the loom, a slightly wider width than the first 2, wool in a natural gray that I had ordered from a small farm in Vermont that Adair had mentioned. The 3rd warp was the best work I had done. The selvages were even on both sides. The beat was consistent through the full length. The cloth had a quality to it that I had not achieved in the first two warps, a firmness and an evenness that told you the tool and the person using it were beginning to understand each other. I had sent Adair a photograph. She had replied, 6 weeks in and already this. Your father was right about you. I had read that 3 times. Meacham called in March to tell me he had a new inquiry. A collector in Virginia named Sattler who had heard about the collection through the network and was specifically interested in the Heddle loom, the one with the unusual Heddle construction that Meacham had identified as possibly New England in origin. Sattler was a serious collector, Meacham said, the kind who understood what he was buying and had the resources to steward it properly. He was not a museum, and the piece would not be publicly displayed, but it would be carefully maintained and made available to researchers on request. I asked Meacham what he thought. He said, your father marked that one as uncertain. He didn't say keep, and he didn't say sell. He said I don't know yet. I know, I said. Meacham said, I think the fact that your father couldn't decide means it's yours to decide without the burden of trying to interpret his intention. He left it open deliberately. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for a week. I went into the back room and looked at the Heddle loom carefully, the way Adair had looked at the Calloway loom when she first arrived, the slow, full attention of someone deciding what they think. The construction was fine, the Heddle design genuinely unusual, the kind of detail that told a story about the person who had made it, a weaver who had worked out a solution to a specific problem and built the solution into the tool. It was a smart object. It was the work of someone who thought clearly about what they needed. My father had written in the 6th notebook, the Heddle loom's construction suggests a maker who was solving a practical problem rather than following a convention. The unusual Heddle is not decorative. It is functional. Someone needed to weave a specific kind of cloth and modified the tool to make it possible. I had read that entry before and noted it. Now, standing in the back room looking at the loom, I understood something I had not understood when I first read it. My father had kept this piece not because he was certain it should stay, but because he was not ready to let go of the question it posed. The question of who had made it and why, and what they had been weaving and what problem they had been solving. The question had no answer in the documentation. The provenance went back to a Kentucky estate sale and stopped there. Whatever the maker's name had been, it was not recorded. Unlike the Calloway loom. Unlike the 3 initials and the date and the family history that made the large loom legible in a way the Heddle loom was not. I called Meacham back the following week and told him to let Sattler know I was open to a conversation. I said, but I want him to come here. I want him to see it in the mill before we talk about anything else. Meacham said, he'll do that. He's that kind of buyer. Sattler arrived on a Thursday in April, a man in his late 60s who drove himself in a practical sedan and arrived precisely on time and shook my hand with the directness of someone who has no interest in performance. He spent an hour in the back room with the Heddle loom, the same way Adair had spent time with the Calloway loom, the slow, full attention. He asked questions that were specific and knowledgeable. He handled nothing without asking first. When he came back to the main room, he looked at the Calloway loom through the open door. He said, that one's not for sale. It was not a question. No, I said. He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already understood. He said, the Heddle loom. The provenance stops at the Kentucky estate. It does, I said. He said, that doesn't diminish it for me. The object is its own evidence. Whoever made it understood their work. I said, I know. We agreed on a price that afternoon. It was within Meacham's range, toward the middle, which felt right for a piece whose story was incomplete. Sattler said he would send his shipper the following month. He shook my hand again at the door and looked at the mill building, the stone and the water wheel and the sycamores behind it, the creek sound in the background. He said, your father built something good out here. He did, I said. He drove back down the gravel track, and I went inside and wrote in the red notebook. The mill was quieter after Sattler left, or seemed quieter, the way a room seems quieter after a particular conversation has ended and left something behind. I made coffee on the small camp stove I had set up near the workbench and sat with it and looked at the shelves. The warping mill, the hay press, the Calloway loom in the back room, the things that were staying, and the space on the shelves where things had been, the 1820 wheel and the Heddle loom, the absences that were not losses but completions. Each piece had gone where it belonged. The wheel to a museum where it would be studied and seen and carry my father's name on the wall. The head'll loom to a collector who had driven here and looked at it with the right kind of attention and understood what he was buying. My father had written in the fifth notebook, "I don't think these things want to be hoarded. I think they want to be where they can be what they are. The job is to understand what each one is and find the place that matches." He had been right. The job was to understand what each thing was and find the place that matched. The Calloway loom's place was here. I had known that since the morning I first put my hand on the breast beam and felt the old-growth oak under my palm. The wood that Caleb Hoke Calloway had chosen and dried and worked with tools that had been put in the ground with him 120 years ago. The loom was home, and home was where it was going to stay. I finished my coffee and went into the back room and sat down at the loom. The third warp was still on it, the gray wool cloth half done, the cloth beam holding what I had already woven. I checked the warp tension, found it good, and began. Left foot, right foot, throw the shuttle, beat. The rhythm came back immediately, the way it always did now, the body having learned. Something the mind had only recently understood. The cloth grew off the breast beam one shot at a time, even and quiet, the sound of the treadles and the beater and the shuttle the only sound in the room except the creak outside. I thought about what Adair had said. By 6 months you will be making cloth you are proud of. I had 2 months left. I was already close. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.